Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be going over Shadowblight Necromancer. So, of course, the whole concept of this build is to be proccing Shadowblight as much as humanly possible. So, if you don't know, Shadowblight is a kind of like a proc at the bottom of the Necromancer tree. It's one of the key passives, and after hitting an enemy with shadow damage 10 times in a row, it will proc a kind of like a hit on them, and that hit does a specific amount of damage based on your weapon's damage, and we're essentially trying to proc that as much as possible. And we do this through copious amounts of dot damage, because damage over time sources, the way they work is every single tick counts as a shadow hit for Shadowblight. So for instance, if I place a corpse explosion on the ground and it ticks twice per second, that's 2 hits for Shadowblight. And of course, we can layer all of these together and get a bunch of Shadowblights per second. So of course, we use Blight as well, because sometimes we won't have corpses, so Blight shoes in for, of course, corpse explosion in that case. Now, of course, this Shadowblight is not a dot. Actually, it is a hit. It can crit, and as you can tell in the footage, you'll be seeing like 600k up to like 800k crits, and that is because of the Shadowblight. And that's pretty much it. The whole concept of the build. Every other thing about this build is built around making sure that that Shadowblight is as consistent as possible. We also have a large amount of crowd control in our build because, of course, you know, getting enemies into the small circle of our corpse explosions means more damage efficiency, like in terms of time, as the more enemies on our dots, the more Shadowblights we proc, which is great. Now, there's a few things that helps us with this. Like I said, we use Blighted Corpse Explosion. That's the first thing we use. We just plop a bunch of those on the ground, and those will passively make Shadowblights for us. We have Blight, as sometimes we don't have a corpse on a singular target, so we want to be spamming that. Also, as well, increases the damage that enemies take, and it also gives us a source of crowd control, slow, and that is important as a large majority of our percentage increased damage is based on crowd controlled enemies, so having all of that increased damage is wonderful. Then, of course, we use stuff like Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils, I have a +3 of it, and I have as much cooldown as possible. And I got my Corpse Tendrils to 6 seconds of cooldown, which means every 6 seconds I can use it on a corpse and drag all the enemies into this little small circle. I can apply Vulnerable. I can also stun them. All of that combined means that I can just place a bunch of Corpse Explosions or Blights under them, and of course proc my Shadowblights, and while they're stunned and stuff, the Shadowblights will go off, and it's great. The next skill that I use, of course, Bone Prison. Bone Prison actually has a few uses. The first use is it makes it so that enemies can't move through the Bone Prison, so I can kind of like trap enemies in a circle, which is really good against really annoying elites and stuff like that, except for the ones that like teleport and stuff. Then, of course, we have an aspect on our gear that makes it so that our Bone Prison spawns a pool of Blight, which is really good for damage uptime because it allows us to get that slow, like I said, from crowd control. It allows us to get the increased damage from Blight itself, and it also makes it so that it's another dot that'll tick for a Shadowblight, because you can have as many Blight pools as you want on underneath an enemy, I believe. And of course, Bone Prison itself applies Vulnerable to enemies within the circle, which is very powerful, as having more ways of applying Vulnerable is great. Then the last skill, or the last 2 skills, we have Blood Mist. This is like the most important skill in your toolkit, mainly because in Diablo 4, there is a very large amount of like crowd control that can be applied to you. You can get frozen, stunned, pulled. There's just so many different things that can happen to you, and Blood Mist allows you to become invulnerable for 3 seconds. We have a few things that add to this. We have a thing that makes it so that the Blood Mist casts Corpse Explosion on nearby corpses, so that we can actually deal damage while we're invulnerable, which is great against those really like fishy rares and elites and stuff. It also reduces the cooldown. We also have, like I said, as much cooldown as possible on gear and as much levels to Corpse Explosion as possible. So that means that our Corpse Explosion is low of cooldown as possible. Right now, mine is like at 14 seconds, and that's barely enough to make sure that we don't get constantly crowd controlled by enemies, because Like I said, Diablo 4 has a lot of that kind of stuff. So having that get out of jail free card is great. And the last skill that we're using is just Reap. That's just allowing us to create a corpse for our first combo when we put a corpse on the ground and stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the overall basis of the build. We're going to go in game and talk about it in more detail. If you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as it's the best way of supporting videos like this one. Now, let's go in game, shall we? Alright, here we are in game with the Blight Corpse Explosion Necromancer. First thing we're going to talk about is the skill choices and stuff like that. So the first one, like I said, Reap. This is mainly for Acolytes Reap, so that we get the corpse under the enemy. That's great, allows us to start our combos off. The next few skills we invest into is Blight. We mainly get the slow and the increased damage, which is wonderful. We have this, which allows us to make more corpses on a singular target. For some weird reason, the Corpse Explosion Blight source, like the damage over time, is applying to this because it says your damage has up to 12% chance. So in theory, it's working for damage over time. It's really weird. We don't know why it's working, but it is working. So wonderful. Getting as many corpses as possible for Corpse Explosion, of course. Like I said, Blood Mist as high as possible with as much cooldown as possible, because we kind of want to be able to spam it as much as possible. We also have Ghastly Blood Mist. This on top of course, the aspect that allows us to consume corpses, makes it so that, of course, we can get the cooldown of this as low as humanly possible every single time, right? Of course, we have Corpse Explosion. We mainly care about getting the miasma set up so that we have the little corpse pool on the ground, which is wonderful. This is all of our clear in general, because all of those damage ticks will, of course, eventually proc Shadowblight, which is great for our damage. We have Bone Prison with as many levels as possible, so of course we can trap them in there and apply Vulnerable. It actually also gives us Essence, which is cool as well. But like just Bone Prison in general, applying Vulnerable for those 6 seconds is great, because that combined with Corpse Tendrils, as you'll see later, that combined with Corpse Tendrils allows us to have a pretty much 100% uptime of Vulnerable on a singular target, which helps immensely. We then grab, of course, extra Essence. This allows us to spam Blight on a singular target, because we spam Corpse Explosion from all the corpses we create from Hewn Flesh here, and it gives us more, more Essence to spam more Blights. And then, of course, more damage after consuming corpse, which is great. We want as much generic more damage as possible. Corpse Central's highest we can possibly get. Like I said, that cooldown of 6 seconds is amazing. We, of course, we get the slow, which is a crowd control, which gives us the increased more damage against enemies because of the control glyph, as you'll see later. Vulnerable as well, which is great. We grab all the darkness stuff here, mainly just for increased shadow damage. So it's like 18% more shadow damage. This is just making it so that our light pools, so like kill trash and stuff like that, which is great. I'm taking 3 points into standalone because we're not really summoning minions, except for from our gloves, which I'll talk about later. Then, of course, Shadowblight. This is just giving us a bunch of increased damage also as well. It makes it so that, like, that little Shadowblight proc, that's the thing that you see that is critting for like 800k, as you'll understand why in a second why that is. So let's talk about, of course, gearing. So for a weapon, this is the most important aspect of the entire build. Being able to get the Shadowblight key passives, deal damage to enemies. It increases the next Shadowblight's damage within 10 seconds. This stacks up to 5 times, and it makes it so every Shadowblight does significantly more damage than the next, and all of that combined allows us to essentially just make our Shadowblights deal as much damage as humanly possible, which is great. Up to 5 times more damage, which is wonderful. It allows this build to even function. This is a drop only, by the way, drop only aspect, so you do need to make sure that you're looking out for it on weapons. On weapons, amulets and rings are mainly what you should be looking for this. Of course, on our weapon here, increased damage of crowd control is fine, increased vulnerable damage is fine, close enemies is fine because we'll usually be close, and we want as much crit multi as possible, as The crit multi allows us to, deal even more damage. I don't have that high of crit yet, as you can tell. With Corpse Tendrils, with this one specific mod here, where is it? This brings us up to 40% crit chance. I'm working on trying to get even more crit chance through building dexterity and stuff. You could drop these gloves and go for like crit gloves and stuff like that, but sadly Necromancer doesn't have that many sources of crit outside of playing like a bone build or anything like that. But even with 40% chance to crit most of the time, it's still plenty of damage. It's not even a problem in that regard. So the next aspect that is the most important is going to be this aspect. We deal just generic more damage after proccing Shadowblight key passive 10 times. This is amazing. It's just like 300, it's like 200% more damage essentially. This will apply to the Shadowblight as well, which is great. It also makes our corpse explosions and stuff do a bunch of more damage, which allows them to clear trash and stuff like that. Mainly on the amulet, you want cooldown, reduction, and movement speed. Movement speed is very important for Necromancer in general because you don't have like a teleport skill, so having a way of getting out of mobs is just being able to move around and stuff, which is great. The next one is going to be the Corpse Tendril mod. This is actually an aspect you can get from the dungeons and stuff like that. It is not a drop only mod, but you only get the smallest version of it, but it's great. It's a lot of crit multi, a lot of crit chance. It's good. It's a good mod. Like I said, on the rings, like crit chance, crit multi, life, damage affected by shadow damage over time. That means just all of your damage, which is great. Same thing with the other ring. We do like the bone prison spawns a pool of blight. This, like I said, makes it so that the enemies inside the bone prison, they'll take that dot damage, which will proc more shadow blights. It'll proc it'll proc the slow, the increased damage taken. It's great. This is a good mod. This is also on the codex. You can go into a dungeon and get it as well. The boots here, we have Blood Mist triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses. It doesn't say it here, but that's only one corpse per second. It's a little annoying, but that's just even more extra cooldown recovery speed for our corpse mist, blood mist. If you get it on an amulet, you can get it like 0.8 per thing, and then that reduces it by like 0.24 seconds for blood mist total cooldown, which is good. But on our boots is 1.5, but that's plenty, right? Also, this gives us a way of dealing damage while we're invulnerable, which allows us to kill really annoying targets. So that's good. I went for just as much movement speed. I went for corpse tendrils levels, because like I said, the more levels you get on these skills, the more cooldown they get, right? Which is great. And of course, as much attributes as possible. If I could choose again, I would probably rather have dexterity instead of that intelligence, because we want as much crit as humanly possible, as you'll see later. Our pants, plus for the blood mist, HP, and then of course chance to make a blood orb on consuming a corpse. This is like half of our sustain. This is amazing for sustain. Each blood orb heals you for like 15% of your life, and there's reasons why we have blood orbs, as you'll see later in the Paragon. Our gloves, these gloves, they make it so that whenever we actually use corpse explosion, instead of it just making an explosion, it'll make a little skeleton that will run at enemies and then explode. This is high quality of life for clear. As you kill one pack, you can use the corpses from that pack to go to the next pack, and so on and so forth, and all of that combined is wonderful. It's just a good source of getting extra like clear out of your corpses, which is wonderful. Also makes your corpse explosion deal 40% more damage, which is great for clearing trash. Now, if you were to dump anything out of this build, this is the first thing you dump though, as you would take this and get gloves with increased crit and stuff like that, with crit chance and stuff. You'd also get a new aspect, so this is definitely the item I would dump first if I were to improve the build further. The chest, just a lot of life, a lot of damage reduction, dexterity. We got that increased armor mod. Whenever you deal any form of damage, so since we're dealing dot damage, this is up 100% of the time. It's actually one of the reasons why I feel so tanky early right now, is the fact that I have so much armor for free. I'm like at 7k armor constantly, which is great. Yeah, the generic chest, like nothing too crazy on it. The helmet here, just life, cooldown, life on kill. That's like all that matters. Everything else doesn't matter. Just the life on kill helps. The life, of course, you want as much life as possible. Then, of course, the cooldown reduction. We really want that because it's generic across the board, makes our corpse tendrils, our bone prisons, and our blood mist up more. The more that our blood mist is up, the better we can do in terms of killing endgame mobs, because like I said, they all have a bunch of freezes and stuff like that. So having a way of getting out of that is amazing. And of course, I just have the damaging an elite aspect, so we just get a little bit of a barrier whenever we handle like an elite aspect. This is like the least usable aspect in the build. You could probably replace this eventually. I haven't really found a better replacement though. And that's pretty much it for the gear. Now for the Book of the Dead here, we're going to talk about it real quick. We deal increased shadow damage, is just more damage, which is great. Skeletal mages, increased vulnerable damage. This is more vulnerable damage, so that stacks on all of our increased vulnerable damage, which is cool. Then, of course, golems, we sacrifice iron golems so that we get 30% more crit damage. It's actually something we changed from last time. 30% more crit damage. So yeah, just 30% more damage. Wonderful. Now for our Paragon here. Where is it? Paragon. Here it is. So mainly our Paragon, the first glyph is just going to be this glyph. It's just going to give us a little bit of extra int, a little bit of extra armor here. And as well, it gives us increased more damage per close corpse. Is really good when we're dealing with a bunch of elites and stuff like that, as there will be a bunch of corpses around giving us more damage. Then up here, we have this glyph socket, just give us a bunch of increased shadow damage. This is definitely one of the weakest ones out of all of the glyphs that I have. So this could easily get axed, but we mainly want it for Flesh Eater, as consuming of 5 corpses grants 40% more damage for 6 seconds. This is pretty much up all the time, which is wonderful. The next glyph, we're completely ignoring Wither. Wither doesn't really matter to us much, because we don't really care about the legendary node, as it's for shadow damage over time, but we're building around Shadowblight. So we're completely skipping it, but what's really nice is this part of the tree, as you can tell, has a lot of intelligence here, so we can get a lot of increased damage to crowd-controlled enemies. This is where a majority of our increased damage is coming from, is specifically this. The reason why this is so strong is because every single int that we get, every int point, also gives us a more damage multiplier on our tree here, as you can tell, up to 50% more damage. So having all of this int on our Paragon as well is really good. Then we go down here, we grab Blood Begets Blood. Like I said, with the blood orbs, you get up to 15% more damage for free, which is great. And then, of course, we have this glyph here, which gives us a little bit of vulnerable damage. This was a lot more important when I did not have vulnerable damage on my weapon, but now that I have vulnerable damage on my weapon, this is a little less important. But it's still good, in my opinion. It's still fine. It's like good, because like I said, we want as much dexterity as humanly possible, and we don't really have that many good choices outside of this. And the last board here, we're going for this bone board, mainly because we have a lot of dexterity nodes around this, and we're going to be going for the territorial glyph here for increased damage to close enemies, and of course dexterity, because now we're building into crit. Every 5 points of dex is like 1% crit, so we're getting a bunch of increased crit from this. And that's pretty much it for the Paragon board. Like I said, we mainly go into Flesh Eater, then we go into Shadow because it just has better nodes, and then we go into Blood Begets Blood for the dexterity scaling and stuff. And that's pretty much it for my Paragon. And that's pretty much it for my build. With all that being said, this has been Dread. I'll have to go do some other stuff. Bye.